we'd like to take about half an hour or 40 minutes or so to close things today. When we designed this set of lectures, we did not think, and in fact purposely tried not to think, about how the topics were connected, whether there were connections, etc. And many of our speakers, many of you, have seen connections, have seen interrelationships. So this is sort of a moment to ask questions, to ask specific questions of speakers that you didn't get a chance to earlier, or of asking them questions about how various topics or various issues of linkage between them, how they might relate, and I will try to moderate. So we got one.
Question for the dean. Can we say that the crime rates are falling because the bad guys are in jail?
Sure you can, because you're an American and you can look at those statistics and you can, and other people will make that argument. That is, understand that because you're talking about essentially the 1991 to present, well, to most recent statistics drop in crime rates. And you put that graph, I didn't get to it, but you put that graph next to the graph of incarceration rates, and you can see now, not instantly with the increase in incarceration rate, but from 1991 on, you see lots more people being incarcerated, and you see lower crime rates. So yes, you can make that argument, but understand that there's a lot of things that affect crime rate. A whole lot of things. Outside the criminal justice system, many people believe the economic conditions affect crime rate. General turmoil in the world or the absence thereof. But it's a very difficult thing to study because we don't isolate variables. We don't do human type of experimentation. That's unethical. Social science experimentation, where we would really study on an individual, a group of individuals. So you have to take it from those overall statistics, and some people would make that argument.
Well, the baby boomers are getting older too, so, our generation has gone from being a strain on the criminal justice system to being a strain on the healthcare system.
That's a very fair point, yes.
Yes.
Well, my question is also directed to the dean. I was interested that when you first started talking about justice, and then you started talking about these two theories that I could call punishment theories, nowhere in there did you fit the idea of restorative justice, which I don't know enough about. So part of my question is, how would you suggest researching that more? But also, and Google is probably already getting that.
But you wanted an honest answer?
Yeah. But where does that fall in your scheme of really striving for justice for victims' families, for our whole culture, for an individual community? And I haven't worked it out in my mind because I'm a slow thinker, but certainly with Marianne's talk too, it goes back to how do we build civil societies that aren't just based around punishment systems, so that we can start building up from something else.
Yeah, I mean, let me first of all plead guilty to an over-aggressive title. And it is. We didn't talk about justice. We talked about justice involves much more than punishment schemes. And that's a very fair point, and I plead guilty to that. I mean, we talked about one little aspect that some people may argue have something to do with justice, but justice is a concept far broader than punishment. To go to your specific question of restorative justice, as I understand, and that's one of those terms that has various meanings based upon various who is using the term, but part of the idea in practice is, can you get the victim together with the alleged perpetrator of a crime and have a dialogue and that's just a little part of it, but that's one of the things people talk about in restorative justice. And since it's the most provocative element, that's what I'll respond to. Because I'm guessing I have what may be a minority Phil might have some views on it, and other people here. I have to tell you, I have some real concerns about processes like that. I have some real concerns about putting victims in the position of having a decision to make about whether the criminal justice system goes forward. As a former prosecutor, I believe that that's the prosecutor's job, and that sounds like a power grab, and to a certain extent, it is a power grab. But I can tell you that one of the hardest, I shouldn't say but one of the hardest parts of the job of the prosecutor is decide who you're going to prosecute. And a big part of being an effective prosecutor is not prosecuting. But another part of it is being willing to prosecute sometimes when a whole lot of people tell you not to, sometimes including the victim of a crime. And so I have, that's only one aspect, but since it's the most controversial aspect, that's what I'm going to react to, and I've been talking too long, so I'm going to let other people talk about, because I think your broader point in reference to Marianne's lecture is we have, the criminal justice system is just a part of, but if we want to create a governmental system that is going to be acceptable to the people who are governed by it, I guess I just answered my own question. It has to be acceptable. People have to have confidence. I was really interested in the discussion of corruption because corruption is so destructive to the process of acquiring that trust. And I probably shouldn't mention a specific example, but I will. And I'm interested in other people's view of it. But I'll tell you a system where I think good people have tried and they've been defeated by corruption again and again, and that is Mexico. And I really believe that good people have tried that there have been good people who have tried to I guess I should say but lessen the effect of corruption on the Mexican criminal justice system. And I don't believe that they've achieved it. And I don't believe that the public thinks that they've achieved it. And I think it's really hurt that country. But what do I know? I mean, I'm outside of my area of influence. I'm going to let other people talk.
What am I supposed to be? Yeah, corruption is bad. I'm curious that you would think that I might take a different position.
No.
The restorative justice, restorative justice question.
Well, I mean, I feel like a bit of a lone wolf in the legal academy right now to be arguing against, because it sounds so good. Retributive justice, let's make everyone whole. Let's just get everybody together and repair the damage. I should say restorative justice. Repair the damage. And I'm concerned about a system that puts that much pressure on the victims of crime, because in reality, that's where that pressure ends up.
Yeah.
Thank you for your response.
Now, I will point out, as speaking as a religious studies professor at the moment, that it's very closely related to the notion of conversion. That the perpetrator, what you're going to do with them is convert them to becoming a good, whole member of society. And we believe that is possible because our society is Christian, and we have this set of values that people can change. If we were in a Buddhist society, we wouldn't ask that question. We wouldn't have that set of logic that would allow us to think that's even possible about human nature. It's a result of, it really goes back a couple of moves to our religious upbringing. Yes, sir.
Well, let's take that question to the next step internationally, which would be the concept of truth and reconciliation commissions, which very much embody that whole concept. One has been And that's a very active role in South Africa, of course. Right now, it may make a difference in the future of Kenyan democracy because there have been some crimes committed there, and people want to hold them accountable in some way for those atrocities 2 or 2.5 years ago after the elections. So I guess the questions for our three panelists would be, how do you see the past and future role of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in democracy promotion? And Steve, also your view on that global dimension of restorative justice. And Phil, we've had some heroes emerge from this. A guy by the name of Nelson Mandela, probably the most respected person in the world. So, do you have any reflections on the global concept of restorative justice as that?
I love, is this thing on? I don't know. Okay. I love the example of South Africa, but in fact it's such an unusual example. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was brought into place in a structure where everyone assumed representative government, where everyone assumed the value of political parties, where everyone assumed that you can't actually argue over ideas. You weren't allowed to assert those ideas if you were black. You were only allowed to assert them if you were white. But there were aspects of the South African system that were very, very consistent with democracy throughout the world. And so when that change comes about, then there becomes this question of what are you going to do with the perpetrators? And the whole Truth and Reconciliation Commission approach was to somehow bring about this expansion of democracy, this true democratization, in a system that already had a lot of the elements in place, without destroying the country. In the way that it was done, there was supposed to be an element of, if you can be shown to have committed a crime, you will be punished for that crime. That didn't always happen, but the Truth and Reconciliation was not just let's stand up and confess our sins and say mea culpa. It was, there was within that at least the idea that the criminal prosecution system could prosecute you. And it was a prosecution system that people at least had some belief in. They didn't think, the only reason this guy isn't going to be prosecuted is because he'll buy off the judge. So there are a whole lot of things that make a Truth and Reconciliation Commission a really interesting step that allows for really some of its true purposes, reconciliation and allowing a society to get on, not ignoring its past. Elements that were there that were not there in other contexts. For example, when I was in Uzbekistan in the early 90s, there were an awful lot of people who were like, dang, can't we just prosecute all the communists? And, what about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission or something like that? All these ideas were being floated. Without those surrounding elements of an existing democratic system, however imperfect, that somehow people have some trust in. No. Then it's just, who do I want to hang out to dry? They're the ones that are getting hung out to dry. Or in the Iraq system, it's, let's go after all the Baathists. There isn't any love felt there. In part, not because South Africa is culturally different, but because of the political elements that were present there and that are not present in other places. And so these are great ideas, but they probably are ideas that will really work well in certain conditions. And in other conditions would, my friends in Uzbekistan, he said, well, but don't you want to know who sent your father to jails where he died? And one of my friends said, no, Marianne, if I knew that, I'd have to go kill that person. I don't want to know that.
If I could follow up on that, your mentioning of Nelson Mandela he's a long way from Diogenes of Thasos. It puts me in mind of another question, and this is an open question. What people and what human qualities do you need to make those things work? Marianne has talked about the system, but we like to think that when we have government institutions, we have rule of law, and laws and institutions keep going on as people come and go, and institutions can be run by people of a certain level of competence, but it doesn't take sainthood or heroism in the modern sense. And I wonder how things would have gone in South Africa if it hadn't been for Mandela and Bishop Tutu and some other people like that. And you might get, you need people to make the system work.
Well, the only thing that I'll add, I mean, very briefly, and it goes kind of back to your question. My discussion was, why do we punish? We didn't even get into why we might not punish. You know, we might. There's a whole lot of reasons we might decide that even. I mean, except a little bit. I mean, I only gave you the lawyer's portion of why we don't punish, because we require proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Maybe there's all sorts of reasons why we might decide that it's in the interest of society to not punish, and that gets. I don't have a good understanding of the Truth and Justice Commissions, and whether you're having that or a war crimes trial with the expectation of punishment afterwards, and that may make a difference.
Joe? I'd be interested in the other panelists' views on how universal this theory of punishment, these two punishment systems, is. Is this something that's really just an Anglo-Saxon concept of the last 300 years, or if you had been in Uzbekistan in 1991 and that's on the board, would they have agreed that those are the two theories? Or in Greece in 300 BC, would they have agreed that these are the two competing theories of punishment?
I think Greek views about justice are heavily on the retributive side. They don't talk much about good of society. It's a factor, but they don't talk about it. There's rehabilitating people. Well, rehabilitating people isn't quite an issue. You know, the Greek uses the same word for price, honor, and punishment. Those are all ways of putting a value on something. And this could be the value of the act. I will give you something, though, that worked. This is more about not punishing. Athenian juries considered a lot about the question about whether convicting this person would be good or bad for the community. And in fact, defendants get up in court and they talk at some length about all of the public services they have performed and their ancestors have performed, and these special taxes on rich people they have had. That's one nice thing about democracy. You can tax rich people more heavily. All the rest of that. And the implied argument is, think about what happens if you exile me and confiscate all my property. You won't have anyone around to do this for you anymore, will you? So the idea of the good of the whole community comes in. I guess, you could call that utilitarian. That also means, by the way, that a person's value to the community might overrule some of the finer points of the law.
For the parts of the world that I look at, of course, if you're looking at former Soviet space, the mode that operated primarily in the Soviet period and probably still does is largely utilitarian. It's either about deterrence or about rehabilitation, depending on where the emphasis is in this particular moment. So you deter crimes or you make them impossible so that they don't harm society, but it's really not so much about retribution. In other places, though, that we're dealing with in the world, particularly in Afghanistan and in Iraq, so much of what we think of as the state's role is the private sphere of law, and especially interpersonal crimes are very much about one person's suit against another, and the response is often about the value of that person. It's a payoff, it's blood money, and so forth, and that is a really, really different way of conceiving justice, and it makes it interesting when a foreign occupying power, like the United States government, begins dealing with an Iraqi society that has its own beliefs about what is just. And so in order to help create a more peaceful society, we buy into that and give blood money payoffs when our soldiers accidentally, or perhaps not so accidentally, kill someone and then they turn out not to be the person that, I think the rate is 2,500 right now in Iraq. And so as an occupying power, we are participating in that system, which is not at all our system, and it presents some interesting new dilemmas about the role of the outsider here in shaping, reinforcing, or negating the norms of a society.
Yes, we do have built into our system, though, elements of that. We have a time-honored tradition of jury nullification, where the facts are clear that the crime has been committed and the jury acquits. We have the concept of pardon, both from the federal and every state level, where we have the Nixon pardon as the perfect example of where, for the good of the country, where in somebody's view, for the good of the country, this crime or these crimes were not even to be investigated. They were just to be left out there. So it's not strange to our system to have that.
Jury nullification is probably most of us are familiar with that term, but it's a reference to a situation where the jury goes back in the room and says, essentially, well, he did it, but come on. Or for whatever reason, we're not going to enter a guilty verdict. We're going to enter a not guilty verdict. And under our constitutional system, the jury clearly has that power. The judge never tells them that they have that power, but the jury clearly has that power.
Whatever. That if that fellow, Nigerian fellow on the airplane had been subdued by a knife in the heart by the fellow who subdued him, the jury would have nullified. If the prosecutor had prosecuted, which he was obligated to do, the jury would have nullified it.
And it's an overlay on the system. Whenever anybody raises jury nullification, I ask them to remember the South of the first half of the last century, where jury nullification, which is often, and I'm an old prosecutor, so that's why I'm putting that in your face, right? Where jury nullification meant you committed a violent crime against an African American, and it didn't matter how many ways it was proven. I shouldn't paint with too broad a brush, but you can fairly paint with a pretty broad brush, and that was power that our system gives to the jury, and that's the way it was used in a form of jury nullification.
I think the issue that Professor Kamp raised about blood money raises a broader question of whether there are some places that are culturally, religiously, socially, really at odds with our concept of democracy. And the question is, do you think that's true? And should the sort of purveyors of democracy be going into those places? And isn't it a little dangerous to do that?
That was for me. I think that there are very significant differences in what different cultures and societies around the world would look at as truly fair, and as a good system for running their own country and so forth. So I clearly somebody coming in without any knowledge and trying to drop in, here is the template for democracy, you go for it. Well, yeah, that probably is not going to be a very successful thing, and in some cases might be a downright dangerous thing. I always worry, though, that those illustrations are often pointed out. Okay, so this is one of those things that you run a fine line when you're talking about the Middle East and with an entire history of Orientalism, with Westerners painting Middle Easterners as these odd creatures who are not like us, who can't understand our values, or contrawise should become like us. They can't have their own values. Either way posits them as an irredeemable other who is not like us. And so when democracy activists from the West are looking at a place like Egypt, and Egyptians look back and say, one, you're not a perfect democracy, point taken. But two, we're not like you, what makes you think that your democratic values are appropriate for our society? One really should look at who is speaking. Is the person who is speaking the empowered person who is enjoying the benefits of the current system? Are we listening to the voice of a bully who is telling us, oh no, my society is irredeemably different from yours, and our values are different from yours, and I like the system as it works, and we don't need your democracy. That is, you don't need it. Do the people whom you are exploiting need it? And that's a hugely revolutionary thing to say. But I think we always have to be careful about who the speakers are. When it's our democracy activists, are we saying we want democracy really because what we really want is the friendly government who will do our bidding? Or do we actually want democracy there? When they say, we don't need your Western-style democracy, is that really coming from, because, you know, once we sort out our problems here with corruption and with other things, we can establish our own sort of system that has no relationship to democracy whatsoever, but all of our people will be happy with? Or is it coming from the position of, you know, shut up already, I'm in power, actually? You know,
in the antebellum South and the postbellum segregated South, Southerners were fond of saying that
we have a
Yankees
different
just
culture.
didn't, we have a different culture,
Yeah.
Yankees just don't understand. Slavery was our peculiar institution.
Yes. I'm always suspicious of those kinds
Yeah.
of arguments, yeah.
Well, we should probably also note that, Iran has a very strong democratic system. I mean, we can debate which kind, but they have elections. They actually picked a lot up from the Americans when they designed this local Persian form of democracy, lots of checks and balances between different systems. And in the end, they did create a group that, after all the checks and balances, could make a decision. That person happens to be a religious figure rather than a political figure.
An unelected religious figure who cannot be taken down from office.
You mean like the Queen of England?
That's what you do that.
Khalid is not elected.
No, I'm not defending it. What I'm trying to get you to think through is the notion that this is a country that sat down and did create a democratic system. As, in fact, we have supported a government that was in favor of ours, but highly authoritarian prior to that with the Shah, Reza Pahlavi. And so we did create, quote unquote, or they created a democratic system. It's not favorable to us. We don't like it. We now think that they are not even following the results of their own elections. They would deny that. We may not.
But this is dealing with what I would call, once again, that procedural definition of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
This is, quote, a democratic system in the absolute absence of freedom of speech. If you do not have freedom of speech, democracy is nonsense. Without freedom of speech comes first, because without that you cannot talk to one another about what your aspirations really are. You cannot actually make your wishes known. And I would say that, yes, that the structure was set up, but it was set up in a time when one group persecuted its opponents. Okay, so this is 1981 to 1983. The Islamists put the commies in jail, and the socialists and so forth tortured them, drove them out. It was a really serious fight, and the ways that they established the state from that point forward gave all of the power to one group. And so it looks democratic. It's once again one of those cases where it looks democratic in structure, but that's democracy where there is no defense of minority rights, no freedom of speech, no many other factors that are what really make for democracy. And I think that's, whenever we're debating these questions of what is democracy and how do you get there, actually, to a certain degree, freedom of expression has to precede everything. When we look at the Iranian Revolution, the reason it comes about is because in 1977, the Shah decided to let up his controls on censorship. People were allowed to speak. They were allowed to say their minds, and that's what brought about the revolution. And after that, the leaders learned their lesson.
About power of elected government versus the supreme leader in Iran, what do you think is really at stake in their last presidential election, if Ahmadinejad had lost, then how different would things be?
Things would be different. Okay, so before Ahmadinejad, when Khatami was president, Khatami could not do much to change the kinds of ways that Khamenei was running things, but he did lighten up on speech. He did what he could to create a freer atmosphere for speech, and that is one of the reasons why we see this particular movement come about, the one that's opposing. And probably that would have been the most significant result. If nothing else, it doesn't change the nuclear thing, it doesn't change the role of the guards, but it probably would have, so many magazines that were actually doing some political speaking in a variety of ways were closed down since 2005. They would at least have an opportunity to reopen. So, and I think that is the most important thing.
Yes, ma'am.
I hope this isn't irrelevant, but it's just something that came to mind as I was thinking about all three of your topics that seemed to sort of hit on all of them, and that is this incident that happened recently in Haiti, where this group of religious people, Baptists from Idaho, went down to Haiti and tried to bring home orphans or children that their parents had given up. And I think of that because it hits on what's a hero, what isn't a hero, what we value as something good. It was done under the guise of a religious thing, so that supposedly is a good thing, but we're putting our values on somebody else. Here are some parents that have been through a trauma and gave up their child and might regret it later. Somehow we think that their bond is not as close as our bond to children. And so we're bringing them back under, they will be better here because of our religion or because of our affluence. And then the deterrent, they use that as an example by punishing them and keeping them in jail, making such a big deal out of it, even though I think they did it, out of goodness, to deter other people from coming and taking their children. So I just thought that sort of fit in with your talk. And I want to know if you had any ideas on that.
That's a repeat of some things that happened when Saigon fell to the communists, too. Again, there were some well-meaning Americans who were spiriting Vietnamese children out of the country to save them from oppression, and where the parents stood on this isn't entirely clear.
What if those Baptist missionaries, rather than themselves paying, how much did they pay to fly to Haiti, had taken all that money and sent it to Haiti and said, here's some money so that you can help parents help keep their kids. Why is it that we think we're in the position of going and saving people? And if we want to save them, why do we choose these modes? Why do we choose the mode of that particular thing? Hero. Yeah, rescue. I know it's nowhere near as interesting to send them money on a regular basis so that they can eat, but...
They can't promote their own religion that way.
Yes. But we also have an American mode that does highly value and praises this sort of action as heroic. I mean, I know I was brought up with it, Here is the heroic missionary who has gone to XYZ place to save them. Let's all give this person money and support them. And, those were some truly wonderful and good people. And when I step back from it and I think, and how much money was that? And how else might it have been used? Of course, maybe we wouldn't have given it at all if it was for the else. Maybe we need to attach it to the person in order to make anything happen. But it brings up all of the interesting problems.
We're back to the Greeks again. There are only so many heroes you can stand.
I saw a hand back here in the middle.
Well, I just wanted to go back to the Iran example because it's so interesting and it's so current. But in addition to the democracy issue, it does raise issues of heroism. To what extent is Ahmadinejad regarded as a hero in society for, quote, standing up to the West? Does that enhance his status as what we might regard as a bad hero? And then, Steve, how do you deal with this, in a way that's not retributive? We're trying to use the instrument of sanctions, and we're trying to not make that retributive by singling out this one element of Iran society, the Revolutionary Guard, said, we're going to aim these sanctions at you and hold the rest of Iranian society harmless. Is that even feasible?
The first part was about heroes, so I get to think for a while.
Well, the interesting thing about sanctions, I'll say something while they're all thinking. The interesting thing about sanctions is if you think about Phil's examples are almost, not all, but almost all about an individual who acts, and his action or her action is representative of society, and therefore there is famine and drought and whatever in punishment. So there's this notion of the encapsulation of the individual's actions as representing society. Well, sanctions are actions against a government, or if you want to individualize it, Ahmadinejad, but the sanctions are against the entire nation. So it's in very many ways, it parallels many of the things that Phil was saying, and to the extent that we can take our modern Western values and sort of say, wait a minute, we think of individual punishment for individual crime, not punish the society for we don't punish the children for the crimes of the parents and all that kind of stuff. So it's an interesting tool here that sort of gets us into types of thinking about societies that were current 3-4 millennia ago.
I have a very, what I'm sure will be a very unsatisfying response to a very interesting question, and that is, I'm such a simple thinker. By that I mean I'm way out of my league when I talk about these things. The American criminal justice system, where we at least have some buy-in to a set of values and an individualistic view, is complicated enough. And I do often find myself, because I've spent so much time in this system, where I automatically think in terms of the American criminal justice system and what we value in it, some of which we talked about today, but only some of which. And when I hear about these international conflicts, as someone who is not knowledgeable about them, I always notice that the first thing I do is I take that template of my worldview and I impose it in the international environment. And then at some later point I say, wait a minute, I don't know what I'm talking about. I just don't know if this works here, and it doesn't seem like it does. And there's the only thing I will say is there's another reflection of that debate that's very current, very hot, very big issue is, do we take the American criminal justice system's procedural values and use them in the context of Gitmo? And I don't know. I'm very curious to hear from others, because I don't know if it works.
But of course we have to use them because we don't have any other system. We can't use somebody else's values to run a court. The sanctions. The sanctions always bring up this problem that we have a sort of international system that has few levers to encourage countries to do things that would probably be better for them and definitely would be better for their international relations. And sanctions are really the only, other than violence, they're sanctions. That's pretty much it. You haven't got anything else to work with. So the true believers in sanctions always go back to the South African case, which once again I posit is a really different case. There are reasons that sanctions worked to change South Africa's behavior, and there are reasons that sanctions didn't work to change Iraq's behavior. And those have to do with the political systems that were operating there. So we can do more sanctions. Do we really think that will change Iran's behavior? Is that the point? That gets us right into the nice little question of, well, is this about retribution? Is it about saying you are behaving badly and so you should be punished regardless of consequences? Or you are behaving badly and we want to change that behavior and so we're doing this. And the argument for sanctions is always put out there in the hope that it will change behavior. And I bet that a lot of the reasons we're doing it are retributive instead. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing or a good thing. Probably in international relations, we need some sets of standards that say bad behavior can't just be condoned and overlooked. On the other hand, wow, is that hard to put in place? Because the same bad behavior by our allies.
Well, Paula, I'm interested in your parallel between divine retribution and sanctions, but doesn't that put the U.S. in the position of being the gods, who are often capricious and arbitrary?
That's an interesting way of putting it.
Is the President of the United States God or Zeus?
Well, there is a polytheistic comparison because, of course, when you think of a polytheistic system, these gods have different departments that they run. So, Athena is the Secretary of War, and I've got my people running.
Yeah.
And you've got Neptune being, the Department of Oceanography. So, their division of labor.
We don't often think of it, and it's not a pleasant thought, but behind the American criminal justice system is violence. Because we allow our government to undertake violent actions on our behalf in the criminal justice system. Because not everybody wants to be arrested. And not everybody, most of us don't want to be arrested, actually. But when we talk about and one of the reasons that I'm hesitant to think about our system, because we don't have, we do have the potential equivalent of violence on a massive scale in the international arena. But there is violence behind our criminal justice system. There's a quote from somebody about how all of us are able to sleep well at night because we know there are rough men willing to do our bidding. Demi Moore, who says, pardon, I've got it wrong, don't I?
Jack Nixon said that, yeah.
Well, a few good men. Demi Moore, when there's that interesting exchange when Kevin Pollak is representing the Marines and he doesn't really like them, and she says, why do you like them so much? And Demi Moore, and she says, because they stand on the wall. Our system is based on violence. Government officials willing to perform violence against those unwilling to participate in the system.
One thing that came out of our invasion of Iraq, I don't know if you consider this democracy, but there went from being a state monopoly on violence, Saddam Hussein could do all of it, and then it went to it went private enterprise, and you had a lot of entrepreneurial types who were being very imaginative about it. We turned it into a free market.
Well, we turned it into a non-state. The definition of the modern state is that which has the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, which is precisely, without that you don't have the modern state.
You do away with the state, then you got a lot of free market.
And in Iraq, a lot of violence.
Does anybody have a question that would allow us to Stan.
It seems to me that the Athenian system of punishment has a lot of merit. And I think it could be at least considered in this country by, take California, for example, with their 3 strikes and you're out.
Yeah.
Well, the prison population there has grown so much, and with the constrictions on their budget as they are, they could take some of those people who have committed victimless crimes, so to speak, and take that money and put it into the educational system, which is now hurting because so much of the monies and the resources are going toward criminal punishment. And basically, maybe our punishment system could weigh societal good or profit versus, for one of the better term, the retribution.
It never ends well when it starts, take California, for example. And I say that as someone who lived 4 years in the state who still has loyalty. I mean, I went to law school in the state, and there's lots about California that I love. So that was mostly a smart aleck comment. Three strikes and you're out. You might think about that. Where does that fit on the slide? I think that's incapacitation. I think that's largely incapacitation. And it's very expensive incapacitation. And it may work. You know, it may work in the sense of you incapacitate enough people who are potentially going to commit crimes, and you will drive down your crime rate, but at what cost? And not just the financial cost, but a low crime rate is obviously not the only thing we value in our society. And you start taking away that kind of freedom and that kind of on a massive scale, you're asking for a big price for lowering the crime rate. But, you know, crime has its own cost. And it tends to be paid by individuals. And we all pay it to a certain extent when we're fearful of crime, but individuals tend to pay it. But I think it's an incapacitation. I think it's a utilitarian notion. I don't think you can defend it on retributivist grounds. You just can't say that if the third strike is, you know, a minor burglary of a convenience store, that's worth the rest of your life. I don't think most of us on retributivist grounds would say that that's a fair measure.
Well, but the point I'm making is by imposing punishment on so many people really detracts from the overall good in many ways, just because of the resources spent on having to detain so many individuals.
Well, and you'll see the statistics about how you can send somebody to Harvard for the price of putting them in prison. Of course, the complicating fact is you got to decide who you're going to send to Harvard, because if you send 20 million people to Harvard, and some of them are people that will end up with Harvard educations instead of being. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I think a good, and I mean, as citizens of this country, we have to constantly ask these questions: are we using limited resources, and resources we don't even have? Are we using limited resources that we and the next 3 generations after us are going to contribute? Because that's our current governmental structure, in a wise way. And I think we should continually ask those questions. And 2.3 million people in prison today, as we sit here. That's a lot. Even if that's incapacitation, that's a lot of incapacitation. That is not only expensive to us, but the human cost of that is pretty high.
Okay, one last question.
I got it.
Yeah, you got it.
Marianne, what you spoke about this morning, open society, I've never heard that before. A lot of the things you talked about, the groups that go into these countries, I've never heard about. If your group was to come to America today, what do you think they would say?
What do the democracy activists say about American democracy? Interestingly, a lot of people who have done, for example, election monitoring in other countries say, why don't we do this here? Florida. And some of them, okay, the ones that are fed through government money, of course, tend to take perhaps less oppositionist and critical views than the open society people. George Soros put millions of dollars into trying to defeat George Bush in 2004, gave a whole lot of money to MoveOn.org, etc. And people who work within his organization would probably say, certain measures that we see as boosting real democracy in other countries are things that probably would enhance our own democracy as well. But largely they're critiquing elections and the ways that we do elections and the way that we fund elections and so forth. It's really far less about the concerns of corruption or of rule of law or those kinds of, or freedom of the media or something like that. But often they become sensitized to those issues in other countries and then come back and say, oh, looking at this with a different lens, it doesn't quite look as pure and clean as it used to. So
that's a good thing for us, isn't it?
Probably so. It's always good to have new perspectives and people sort of stimulating us to think again and say, are we doing this as well as we could? Could we probably do it better?
This gentleman said to me, I said, I didn't know you had a religious studies program, and there's a Muslim specialist, and I said, well, maybe we can figure it out, what they're thinking. And he said, well, if you're Muslim, they think different than I do. And I hadn't thought of that. And somebody coming back and looking at us again is looking at it differently than I'm looking at it. I think that's probably good for America. Although it makes me uncomfortable.
Wouldn't it be funny to have foreign election monitors at our elections? What? That would be really weird.
Well, I was thinking of picking up on the new ideas and new ways of thinking is, you have a thing like that? New thoughts. That was our last motto. But anyway, it's time to draw this to a conclusion. Thank you all very much for coming. We've had a